It had been an ordinary Tuesday morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun still stretching over neatly lined homes, and the world felt stable. The homeowner, who had lived peacefully in the community for several years, had parked his truck in the driveway the night before, the same way he had countless times before. It was a habit as familiar as locking the front door or switching off the lights. But when he stepped outside that morning, a folded sheet of paper flapping gently beneath his windshield wiper shifted the course of everything. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a flyer. The neighborhood was prone to real estate agents leaving pamphlets offering to buy homes or advertise new listings. But the moment his eyes traced the official-looking letterhead of the Homeowners Association, he knew this was different. The words were bold and clear. Violation notice. Unauthorized parking. Confusion settled in first, then disbelief. It was his driveway, his property, and his vehicle. There was no obstruction, no safety hazard, no clutter spilling into the street. Yet, according to the paper, parking in his own driveway was against the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA's bylaws. The absurdity of it gnawed at him. He had moved into the neighborhood for peace and stability, not petty conflicts over where he could park his truck. The more he read, the clearer it became. This was not a warning. It was a fine $150, payable within 30 days. His eyes narrowed at the bold print. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, about an organization flexing authority where it wasn't deserved. That morning set off a cascade of emotions. First came disbelief, then irritation, and eventually a simmering anger. He couldn't help but look around the street, noticing cars parked in driveways up and down the block, sedans, SUVs, and even a van sitting comfortably without a paper tucked under their wipers. Why was his truck singled out? Was it because it was larger? Because someone on the board disliked its presence? Or perhaps because it was him? He folded the notice and slipped it into his pocket. But the paper weighed on him like lead. By the time he drove off to work, his mind was already circling questions, replaying the scenario in loops. He replayed past HOA meetings he had attended or rather, endured. He remembered the smug expressions of certain board members, the way they seemed to thrive on minor infractions, enforcing rules with an iron grip while ignoring their own. By evening, the notice still burned in his mind. He retrieved it from his pocket, flattened the creases, and studied the language again. The bylaws were cited vaguely, with no clear section number or detailed explanation. Just a blanket claim about maintaining community harmony and aesthetic consistency. The lack of specificity was intentional, he realized. It was a catch-all phrase, one that could be bent and twisted to suit the whims of the board. The injustice was too obvious to ignore. He considered paying the fine, brushing it off as an annoyance to avoid trouble. But that idea curdled in his gut. If A gave B, in what would be next? A fine for leaving his trash bin visible for an hour too long? A penalty for planting flowers not on their approved list? The more he thought about it, the more he knew compliance would only invite further abuse. So instead of grabbing his checkbook, he grabbed the community's governing documents from the binder he had kept tucked in a drawer since moving in. The rules were thick, filled with dense language, but he began combing through them carefully. Hours passed as he highlighted phrases, cross-referenced sections, and scribbled notes in the margins. The deeper he went, the more he realized how much of the HOA's power relied on intimidation rather than clarity. What stood out most was a section tucked near the back of the document, one that allowed homeowners to formally challenge citations. Few residents ever bothered, likely out of fear or exhaustion. But the process was there, and it was his way forward. That night, he drafted his response. He kept his tone professional, but firm. He cited sections of the bylaws the HOA had failed to reference, pointed out inconsistencies, and demanded proof that his truck was in violation of any clearly defined rule. It wasn't just about parking anymore, it was about drawing a line. The letter was printed, signed, and delivered the next morning. As he slipped the envelope into the HOA's drop box near the clubhouse, he felt the first spark of defiance. He wasn't going to roll over. If they wanted to make this a battle, he was prepared to fight. By the end of that week, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a notice on his windshield but an official envelope from the HOA board. He opened it at the kitchen table. Riley the dog curled at his feet, his stomach churning with anticipation. The response was curt, dismissive, and dripping with arrogance. They rejected his appeal without addressing his arguments, citing their broad authority to enforce community standards. The anger he had felt before reignited, stronger this time. It was clear they had no interest in fairness or clarity. They wanted compliance, submission, and silence, but he wasn't the kind of man to bow under pressure. If anything, the rejection fueled him. That evening, he sat down at his computer, determined to dig deeper not just into the HOA's documents, but into the law itself. State statutes, case precedents, and homeowners' rights were all within reach, and he was ready to use them. The HOA had fined him for parking in his own driveway, but they had no idea what they had just unleashed. He wasn't simply defending his truck, he was defending his rights. And by the time he was finished, they would regret ever slipping that notice under his windshield. The rejection letter from the HOA board sat on the table like a challenge. It was short, almost mocking, with no acknowledgement of the detailed points he had raised. It didn't matter that he had cited their own bylaws back at them. They brushed it aside with a single sentence, hiding behind their claim of broad authority. For many homeowners, that would have been the end of the fight. Most people would have sighed, written a check, and moved on, hoping to avoid further trouble. But for him, the letter had the opposite effect. It solidified his resolve. The following week, another notice appeared. This time, it wasn't about the truck, it was about the length of his grass. According to the HOA, it exceeded the maximum height permitted by their landscaping guidelines. He had measured it himself earlier that morning, and it was well within limits. The violation was fabricated, a tactic meant to pressure him into compliance by piling on accusations. Neighbors began whispering. Some gave sympathetic glances when passing by, while others avoided eye contact entirely. Everyone in the community knew how the board operated, but few ever stood up against them. The unspoken rule was simple: don't make waves. And yet, waves were exactly what he was making. The truck in the driveway had become a silent act of defiance, a symbol that he wasn't giving in. The HOA responded by doubling down. Each week brought a new notice, each fine more ridiculous than the last. Trash cans visible for too long, a supposed oil stain on the driveway, even a complaint about the color of his curtains visible from the street. It was harassment dressed up as enforcement, and it became clear that they were targeting him specifically. But he wasn't alone. A few neighbors quietly approached him, sharing their own stories. One family had been fined for a small garden gnome. Another had been threatened over the color of their front door. A retired couple admitted they had once tried to appeal a violation but gave up after being ignored. Whose does it? The pattern was undeniable. The HOA ruled through fear, banking on the idea that no one would push back hard enough to stop them. Instead of retreating, he began documenting everything. Each notice was photographed, filed, and logged with dates and times. He kept detailed notes of every interaction, including the condescending tone of the board president when they crossed paths in the neighborhood. He gathered statements from neighbors who had experienced similar harassment, their voices hushed, but their frustration palpable. Piece by piece, he was building a case not just for himself, but against the very culture of abuse the HOA had fostered. The board, however, continued to act as though they were untouchable. At the next HOA meeting, the president addressed the community with thinly veiled arrogance. The board boasted about maintaining standards and protecting property values, while ignoring the growing tension their heavy-handed approach created. Homeowners sat quietly, some nodding along out of fear, others staring down at their folded hands. He sat in the back of the room, listening intently. Every word from the president's mouth was ammunition. The board claimed they were protecting the community, yet their actions were petty, inconsistent, and When the meeting ended, he left without saying a word. But inside, he felt a storm gathering. That night, he expanded his research. He dug deeper into state laws governing homeowners associations. He discovered that many of the HOA's so-called rules were unenforceable under state law. Parking restrictions, in particular, had to meet specific legal criteria. Driveways, being private property, were protected. The board's claim of aesthetic standards was flimsy at best and illegal at worst. The more he uncovered, the clearer the path became. He didn't just want to win against the fines, he wanted to hold the HOA accountable. He began contacting attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes, carefully explaining the situation and sharing his growing archive of evidence. Some were hesitant, warning him of the uphill battle, but others saw the potential in his case. One lawyer in particular expressed interest, noting that this could expose not only the unfair fines, but also the abuse of authority that had been festering within the board for years. Meanwhile, the fines continued to arrive, each one more outrageous than the last. The HOA seemed oblivious to the fact that their intimidation tactics were only strengthening his resolve. Neighbors watched closely, some quietly rooting for him, others waiting to see how far the board would go. The once quiet suburban street was becoming a battleground, the tension almost tangible. The HOA believed they were pushing him into submission. What they didn't realize was that they were pushing him toward something far more dangerous for them, a full-blown legal confrontation. He was no longer just a homeowner fighting a parking fine, he was becoming the voice of a frustrated community, the one person willing to take the fight where no one else dared. And as he sat at his desk one evening, surrounded by stacks of violation notices, highlighted bylaws, and state legal codes, he felt the tide turning. The HOA had escalated the battle, but he was ready to escalate it further. The fines had started with a truck parked in his driveway, but by the time this was over, the HOA would realize they had picked a fight they could never win. By the time summer arrived, the dispute with the HOA had grown into something far larger than anyone in the neighborhood anticipated. What began as a petty fine for parking a truck in a private driveway had spiraled into a campaign of harassment, orchestrated by a board that thrived on intimidation. But in their arrogance, they had overlooked a crucial detail. Their target was patient, meticulous, and unwilling to back down. The documentation he had amassed over the past several weeks filled multiple binders. Each violation notice was neatly organized by date. Every email was printed and filed. Photos of his perfectly legal truck in the driveway, time-stamped and clear, formed a gallery of evidence. Statements from neighbors, carefully collected and signed, painted a picture of a board that routinely abused its power. And at the center of it all was the HOA's glaring mistake: attempting to enforce rules that had no legal foundation. With this mountain of evidence, he scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in HOA litigation. The attorney, a sharp and seasoned professional, flipped through the binder with growing interest. The more she read, the more her eyebrows rose. When she finally closed the file, she leaned back in her chair and gave a knowing smile. The HOA, she explained, had not only overstepped its bounds, they had violated state law multiple times. Under state statutes, homeowners associations could regulate common areas, but their authority over private property was limited. Driveways, being part of the DDE lot, could not be arbitrarily regulated without explicit and legally sound provisions in the governing documents. The board's vague claims of aesthetic standards were insufficient, unenforceable, and, in some cases, outright unlawful. Worse yet, their repeated issuance of baseless fines bordered on harassment, something the courts did not look kindly upon. Armed with this information, he felt more confident than ever. But the lawyer advised patience. Rather than rushing into a lawsuit, the best strategy was to let the HOA dig its own grave. HOA fine. Each baseless notice, each heavy-handed letter would strengthen the case against them. It was a matter of endurance, allowing the board's arrogance to build the very case that would dismantle them. And so, he waited. The HOA continued its barrage, oblivious to the trap being set. More fines arrived, claiming violations that didn't exist. One notice accused him of leaving construction equipment in the driveway, a reference to his toolbox in the back of the truck. Another accused him of unsightly landscaping because a single patch of grass had turned brown in the heat. Each notice was copied, photographed, and cataloged. Each was another nail in the board's coffin. The neighbors began to notice his calm demeanor. While most homeowners panicked at the sight of a violation letter, he remained composed, even amused. Word spread quietly that he was preparing something big. Some neighbors began to confide in him, offering even more stories of board harassment. A young couple revealed they had been fined for hanging string lights in their backyard. An elderly resident shared that the board had threatened her with legal action over a flower bed. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they also added depth to the narrative he was building. By midsummer, the evidence was overwhelming. The lawyer prepared a formal demand letter, meticulously outlining the HOA's misconduct. It cited state statutes, referenced their governing documents, and included a detailed list of every improper fine levied against him. It warned that if the harassment did not cease immediately, a lawsuit would follow, seeking not only damages, but also attorney's fees and punitive penalties. The letter was delivered by certified mail, ensuring that every board member received it. The response was predictable. Instead of backing down, the board doubled down. They dismissed the letter as bluster and continued their campaign of harassment. They believed their authority was untouchable, that no homeowner had the means or resolve to challenge them in court. What they didn't realize was that their arrogance had already sealed their fate. The lawyer filed suit in county court. The complaint was thorough, citing chapter and verse of state law, attaching exhibits of violation, notices, photos, and neighbor testimonies. It didn't just attack the fines for the truck, it painted a picture of systemic abuse by the HOA. The damages sought were significant, enough to shake the board to its core. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the community. For the first time, homeowners began to whisper not about the HOA's power, but about its vulnerability. People who once cowered at the sight of a violation now watched with cautious optimism, wondering if the balance of power was finally shifting. The board, once so confident, now faced the possibility of public embarrassment and financial ruin. In the weeks leading up to the first hearing, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The board president, once smug and condescending, avoided eye contact when passing by. Other board members looked nervous, their once firm postures softening under the weight of uncertainty. The day in court was set. And as he reviewed the binders of evidence one last time, he knew he was ready. What started as a fight over a truck had become something far greater. A battle for accountability, not just for himself, but for every homeowner who had suffered under the HOA's unchecked power. The HOA had wanted to make an example out of him. Instead, he was about to make an example out of them. The courthouse loomed tall and indifferent, its stone facade casting long shadows across the parking lot as he arrived on the morning of the first hearing. The weight of months of frustration, preparation, and anticipation sat heavy on his shoulders, but it was accompanied by something else: resolve. He wasn't just walking into court to defend his right to park in his own driveway. He was walking in to expose a system of abuse that had plagued the entire neighborhood for far too long. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as neighbors, curious onlookers, and even a few reporters filled the benches. The lawsuit had stirred up far more attention than the HOA anticipated, and the whispers of discontent had spread beyond the community gates. Local media, always hungry for stories of overreaching HOAs, had caught wind of the case, and now cameras lingered outside the courthouse doors. The HOA board members sat together at the defendant's table, stiff and visibly uncomfortable. The president, usually so smug and commanding, shifted uneasily in his chair, avoiding eye contact with the plaintiff. Their attorney, a well-dressed man with a practiced smile, whispered instructions and tried to maintain an air of confidence. But even from a distance, their unease was clear. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney attempting to frame the issue as a matter of simple rule enforcement. He spoke at length about community standards, uniform aesthetics, and the collective good. He tried to paint the plaintiff as a troublemaker who refused to abide by the same rules as everyone else. It was a performance designed to appeal to authority and tradition. But when it was time for the plaintiff's attorney to speak, the entire tone shifted. Calmly and methodically, she dismantled the HOA's arguments. She began by presenting the governing documents, pointing out that nowhere did they explicitly grant the HOA authority to regulate private driveways. She then cited state statutes that placed clear limits on the powers of associations, emphasizing that the fines issued were not only baseless, but illegal. The evidence spoke louder than any argument could. Binder after binder was placed before the court, each filled with violation notices, photographs, and correspondence. The photos of the truck, neatly parked within the driveway, made the HOA's claims appear absurd. Testimonies from neighbors, read aloud by the attorney, painted a damning portrait of a board that harassed residents over trivialities, exceeding its authority at every turn. The judge listened attentively, occasionally furrowing his brow as the plaintiff's attorney walked him through the evidence. At one point, she highlighted the HOA's repeated disregard of the demand letter, stressing how they had not only failed to correct their behavior, but had escalated it, almost daring the homeowner to take them to court. The HOA's attorney attempted to counter, but his arguments began to unravel under the weight of facts. Each time he tried to assert the board's authority, the judge would refer back to the documents and statutes presented, shaking his head slightly. The more the HOA pushed, the more desperate they appeared. By midday, it was clear the tide had turned. The judge openly questioned the HOA's conduct, noting how their fines appeared arbitrary and unsupported by their own governing documents. He expressed concern over the pattern of harassment evident in the evidence, particularly the repeated targeting of a single homeowner. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had once been afraid of the board now exchanged knowing glances, their hope renewed. When the plaintiff's attorney delivered her closing remarks, the courtroom was silent. She framed the case not just as a personal dispute, but as a matter of principle. If the HOA could fine a man for parking in his own driveway, then no homeowner's property rights were safe. This wasn't merely about a truck, it was about the fundamental right to enjoy one's home without fear of unjust persecution. The judge announced that he would issue a ruling in the coming weeks, but his demeanor spoke volumes. The HOA's case had been exposed as flimsy, their authority questioned at its very core. The board members left the courtroom pale and shaken, their once firm grip on power visibly slipping. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were waiting. Reporters asked questions, neighbors spoke out, and the story began to spread across local news channels. What had started as a quiet neighborhood feud was now a public spectacle. With the HOA's reputation crumbling before the eyes of the community it claimed to serve. For the homeowner, the waiting game had begun. The verdict was not yet delivered, but the momentum was clear. The HOA had been dragged into the light, and their days of unchecked authority were numbered. Weeks passed with an air of anticipation that hung heavily over the neighborhood. Every walk down the street felt charged with speculation. Some neighbors avoided eye contact with the board members, while others whispered in hushed tones at the mailbox cluster. Everyone was waiting for the court's decision, and for once, the residents of the community dared to imagine a future where the board's arrogance would finally face consequences. When the ruling arrived, it did not come as a surprise to the homeowner, but it sent shockwaves through the HOA. The judge had sided decisively with him. In a detailed opinion, the court declared that the HOA had no authority to regulate private driveways, rendering every fine issued against him null and void. But it went further. The court recognized the harassment he endured, citing the repeated, baseless violation notices as a pattern of abuse. The HOA was ordered to reimburse every dollar in fines, cover all attorneys' fees, and pay additional damages as a penalty for their misconduct. The financial blow was staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars were now owed by the HOA, money that would have to come directly from the association's budget. What had once been a war chest funded by homeowners' dues was now a liability, threatening to bankrupt the board. The ruling made local headlines, splashed across evening news segments under banners like HOA overreach backfires and homeowner wins landmark case. The board's humiliation was no longer confined to the neighborhood. It was public and undeniable. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence began to step forward. Empowered by the ruling, they shared their own stories of petty fines, harassment, and intimidation. One by one, their voices grew louder, forming a chorus of dissent against the very organization that claimed to protect their interests. The board, once feared and untouchable, now looked weak and cornered. The fallout was swift. Several board members resigned within days of the ruling, citing stress and personal reasons. In truth, they were fleeing the shame of their public defeat. The president, however, refused to step down immediately. He attempted to rally what little support remained, insisting that the ruling was unfair and that the HOA would appeal, but his words rang hollow. The community had seen enough, and no one wanted to follow him into another doomed battle. For the homeowner, The victory was sweet, but it was also sobering. He had set out to defend himself against an unjust fine. But what he uncovered was a system built on fear and unchecked authority. His case had exposed the cracks in the foundation of the HOA, but it had also shown him how deeply those cracks ran. Many neighbors thanked him personally, some with tears in their eyes, for standing up when they could not. They called him a hero, though he never saw himself as one. He was simply a man who refused to be bullied. The board scrambled to recover, but the damage was irreversible. With their funds depleted and their reputation in ruins, they struggled to maintain even the most basic responsibilities like landscaping and pool maintenance. Homeowners, emboldened by the verdict, began petitioning for a full overhaul of the board. Within weeks, a special election was announced, and the once dominant leadership faced the possibility of being voted out entirely. The president fought bitterly to cling to power, but the tide had turned against him. His neighbors no longer saw him as a leader, but as the architect of their humiliation. Yard signs sprouted up across the community calling for change, and meetings that were once sparsely attended became packed with residents demanding accountability. The balance of power had shifted, and the board was on the verge of collapse. Through it all, the homeowner remained calm and resolute. He attended the meetings, listened to the voices of his neighbors, and quietly supported efforts to rebuild the association into something fair and transparent. He knew the battle was not over. Power, once abused, was not easily surrendered. But he also knew that the board's grip had been broken, and that was a victory no ruling could take away. The courtroom battle had ended, but the war for the community's future had just begun. The verdict had lit a fire that could not be extinguished, and the next chapter would determine whether the neighborhood could rise from the ashes of its broken HOA or collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. The special election was scheduled for a crisp autumn evening, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt unlike anything it had in years. For once, residents weren't dreading an HOA meeting. Instead, they came in droves, filling the clubhouse to capacity. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation, nervous energy, and the faint sense that history was about to be made. The outgoing board members sat stiffly at the front table, their faces etched with defeat. The president, still clinging to a thread of defiance, shuffled his papers nervously, avoiding the eyes of those he had once ruled over. Around him, the empty chairs of his former allies spoke volumes. Resignations had thinned his ranks, leaving him exposed. Neighbors stood to speak, one after another. Their voices carried the weight of years of pent-up frustration. They spoke of fines for harmless decorations, harassment over trivial landscaping choices, and the constant fear of receiving yet another violation notice in the mail. The verdict in court had broken the silence, and now the truth spilled out freely. What was once whispered in private conversations at backyard barbecues was now declared openly for all to hear. When the time came for the vote, it was decisive. The president was ousted, along with the last of his loyalists. In their place, a new slate of board members was elected, ordinary homeowners who had grown tired of the fear and intimidation that defined their community. They promised transparency, fairness, and above all, respect for the people they represented. The shift in leadership was almost immediately felt. Notices of petty violations ceased. Meetings became forums for collaboration rather than battles of authority. The atmosphere in the neighborhood lightened, with neighbors who had once avoided each other now chatting freely by their driveways, no longer worried about being reported for imagined infractions. The clubhouse bulletin board, once plastered with threats of enforcement, now displayed community events and volunteer opportunities. For the homeowner who started it all, the transformation was surreal. He had never sought to be a revolutionary figure. All he had wanted was the right to park his truck in his own driveway without harassment. Yet his refusal to be intimidated had sparked a movement that reshaped the very foundation of the neighborhood. His driveway, once the symbol of conflict, now stood as a quiet monument to resilience and determination. The service of justice extended beyond his personal victory. The damages awarded by the court provided relief to other homeowners as well, since the HOA could no longer levy arbitrary fines to refill its depleted coffers. Instead, the new board worked to repair the financial damage left behind by their predecessors. It wasn't easy, but the sense of unity among the residents made the burden lighter. For the first time in years, people believed the HOA could actually serve its intended purpose: to protect and uplift, not punish and oppress. As weeks turned into months, the story of the court battle spread far beyond the neighborhood. Other communities, dealing with their own tyrannical boards, found inspiration in the tale of one man's refusal to yield. Local news outlets occasionally checked back in, marveling at the dramatic turnaround. Some even called it a landmark case in curbing HOA abuse. The man himself remained humble. He tended to his yard, parked his truck in his driveway, and lived his life as he always had. Yet whenever he looked around the neighborhood, he felt a quiet pride. Children played freely without their parents worrying about fines for sidewalk chalk. Families decorated for holidays without fear of reprimand. Elderly residents tended to their gardens without dread of arbitrary enforcement. Life felt normal again, better than normal. The old board had tried to make an example out of him, but in the end, he had made an example out of them. Their arrogance had been their undoing, and their downfall became the community's liberation. On a cool evening, months after the dust had settled, he sat on his porch, watching his neighbors gather in the park for a community potluck organized by the new board. Laughter and conversation drifted across the lawns, and the glow of string lights hung above the tables. The bitterness that once poisoned the neighborhood had been replaced with warmth and camaraderie. It struck him that true victory wasn't measured in fines, overturned, or damages awarded. It was measured in the freedom to live peacefully in one's home, surrounded by neighbors who no longer feared each other. It was measured in the reclaiming of a community once held hostage by power-hungry hands. The HOA had tried to strip him of his rights, but in their failure, they gave the neighborhood back its soul. And as he leaned back, listening to the joyful noise of a community finally at peace, he knew that no amount of harassment or intimidation could ever erase what had been won. The battle was over. The lesson, however, would endure.